So today we have the pleasure of hearing from two speakers who are co-authors of the report From Risk to Resilience, Indigenous Alternatives to Climate Risk Assessment in Canada. This report was published by the Yellowhead Institute in the fall of 2024. So first we have Brett Huson. Brett is a Gitxsan author, researcher, and founder of Atula, an Indigenous research hub. As a research associate with the Prairie Climate Center, he helped integrate Indigenous knowledges into the Climate Atlas, and he serves on the Adaptation Futures 2025 Steering Committee, working to bridge Indigenous and Western knowledge systems to promote cultural resilience. We also have Janna Wale, who is Gitxsan from Gitanomax First Nation and is also Cree Métis on her mother's side. Janna uses a complex human environmental systems approach and believes that this lens can be used when looking for ways to bridge Western and Indigenous climate work. Janna holds a Bachelor of Natural Resource Sciences and a Master's in Science and Sustainability, where her work focuses on climate resilience in Indigenous communities using a seasonal rounds model. She has published 2 reports in collaboration with the Yellowhead Institute and was named an Indigenous Trailblazer through the Diversity and Sustainability. So please join me in welcoming Brett and Janna to our sessions today.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, can everybody see that? Should be good.
Looks good on my end, so I'm going to assume everyone can. Thanks.
All right. Nide. Greetings. Thank you all for being here. We're here today to explore the intersection of Indigenous knowledge and climate risk assessment. We're challenging conventional approaches that focus too much on infrastructure while missing the bigger picture, the interconnectedness of people, land, and ecosystems. So this conversation is about shifting perspectives while examining how Indigenous ways of knowing can lead to more effective, holistic resiliency strategies that address climate risks and strengthen cultural and ecological continuity for future generations. We'll start with a bit of our introduction of ourselves before diving into the discussion of the risk assessments in Canada. We'll also be examining Indigenous perspectives on risk and how they should be integrated into our current approach of the systems.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. I'm a Hilu, Janna Wale Wae, Gitxsan Ni'i, Gitxsan Lahyep, Noch Floral Whale, Cree Métis near Spiritwood and Meadow Lake, Niguot Cliff Whale, Wilsalaxi Gitxsan, Lu Amalgodi Wingetasum. My name is Janna Wale and I'm from Gitanomax First Nation on my dad's side. I'm also Cree Métis, English and Irish on my mother's side. My Métis last names are Charette and Arcand from near Spiritwood and Meadow Lake in Saskatchewan. I always start with who I am and where I'm from because this gives you context for my worldview and the knowledge that I can share.
Hetchumsget Wae, my real name is Hetchumsget. Laxnitich will Kalhuchswi, will Gutkunuch will Sowetwi. So I come from the territory of the Caribou Ravine, and I'm from the House of the White Owl. So I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction to what I do and what my work is. So I started Aluta. Aluta is an Indigenous-led research institute that's dedicated to bridging Indigenous and Western knowledge systems. It's rooted in Gitxsan philosophy. So we collaborate with communities, academics, and organizations to create culturally grounded, interdisciplinary, and impactful research and projects. So at Aluta, we break down research by integrating Indigenous knowledges with diverse disciplines, ensuring that cultural, ecological, and governance perspectives shape every stage. Our work prioritizes relationship building, community-led insights, and methodologies honoring Indigenous ways of knowing and doing.
So as a Gitxsan researcher, Personally, I often look for ways to bring my culture and my Gitxsan worldview into my work. If you're unfamiliar with the Gitxsan are a people of the River Mist. Our landADAPT, or territory, is about 36,000 square kilometers in northwestern BC of what settlers call British Columbia, near Smithers and Terrace. There are 62 house groups across the landADAPT, and there are also 6 reserves around Gitxsan territory. Gitamax, where I'm from, Gitwangach, Gitsagukla, Gitnyao, Sigadak, and Anspayox. And we are a Northwest coastal people, meaning that we share coastal and cultural similarities with some of the nations that kind of live and continue to live along the coast of what is now known as British Columbia.
So with Gitxsan protocols, they're deeply rooted in our ayok, or our laws, which guide governance, land stewardship, and social relationships. These protocols, they emphasize accountability, reciprocity, and respect, ensuring that decisions are made collectively and with long-term sustainability of the land in mind. So through our oral histories, our dawak, and the house governance systems, or the WILPs, Gitxsan society maintains structured yet adaptive for ways of managing territory, knowledge, and responsibility across generations.
So why are risk assessments even important? In my relatively young lifetime, I'm not even 30 yet, I've witnessed a pandemic, record-breaking fire seasons, and devastating flooding. Even if we were able to turn the tides right now and stop emitting, carbon, we would continue to feel the impacts of climate change for approximately the next 30 years. And this is why it's important to begin the process of adaptation in ways that make sense for our communities and that reflect our values, our priorities, as well as our visions for the future. In order to begin this process of adaptation, communities are looking for ways to understand what events are most likely to happen, what events are most likely to impact them, and how they want to respond within their own social ecological contexts. And one partial answer to this is to conduct a climate risk assessment. Risk assessments are, in essence, a theoretical tool that helps to identify the likelihood of a future climate event.
So, what key questions are we trying to answer? We co-authored a report with the Yellowhead Institute to highlight gaps in Canada's current risk assessment process, and just to spark discussion on building a more holistic and comprehensive approach to risk. So, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the views we share today are our own. They do not necessarily reflect those of our families, our communities, or our nation as a whole. So two key questions that has guided this work is, how do colonial narratives and understanding of risk shape our collective climate resilience, cultural practices, and recognition of natural interdependencies? And two, how can Indigenous approaches to land and water relationships provide a more effective framework for understanding and responding to climate change? So to answer these, we examined why existing risk assessment processes fall short, and more importantly, how we can shift toward a future that truly integrates Indigenous knowledges and priorities.
So risk assessments as they are now are falling short in a couple of different ways, which are leading to gaps in the implementation and the actioning of adaptation strategies. First and foremost, there is no standard definition or understanding of how the term risk is understood in Canada. They're often based on historical data, and they're meant to evaluate the probability, the severity, and the frequency of future events using economic data to kind of cost out impacts. And that's kind of about as far as standardization goes. Past this, risk changes depending on where you are geographically and where you are jurisdictionally. In other words, depending on who is responsible for creating the risk assessment plan. In fact, the word risk itself is understood differently by different people. Its meaning changes across cultures, across disciplines, and even across life experiences. For example, risk to a skilled hunter would look very different compared to someone who has never been in the backcountry before. So this means that it's becoming increasingly difficult to even get on the same page about what is important and what a risk is, and therefore what actions we need to take to kind of address the risks at hand.
The second significant gap in Canada's risk assessment frameworks is their narrow focus on built environment and infrastructure, mainly ignoring the broader social ecological system. Risk assessments tend to prioritize areas that have received significant government investment, so more developed urban and industrial places that generate capital. In BC, cities like Vancouver, Kelowna, and Victoria often take precedence. Because these frameworks are shaped by financial loss and economic priorities, they ultimately serve only a portion of society. This makes them inaccessible, incomplete, and inadequate for communities, particularly Indigenous and marginalized groups. These communities are often excluded from high priority areas by design, yet they face the greatest climate risks. This narrow approach fails to capture the full climate context and leaves critical vulnerabilities unaddressed.
And when we say by design, what we really mean is colonialism. Indigenous communities in general have been left out of urban and infrastructural planning, with many communities today struggling with housing, with infrastructure like roads, services, and even essentials like clean and running water. Indigenous communities impacted by climate events in the last few years have been hit the hardest and continue to fall through risk assessment gaps because the risks that they have faced have been largely institutional rather than natural. Other communities, through legislation like the Indian Act, were relocated to areas and land that were deemed less desirable by settlers and are often the ones that are more exposed to more climate risks. Further to this, there are now gaps in knowledge and very intentional ones. Residential schools, which were open from 1867 to around 1996, which is actually around when I was born, led to a very intentional gap in the transmission of knowledge and cultural practices. This loss has resulted in our communities having to work harder to reclaim and practice cultural activities that used to be able to help to mitigate risk in our areas. Our communities are also disproportionately exposed to man-made risks, such as extractive-based risks, which are more likely to be exacerbated by climate change and more costly to remediate and more often placed within Indigenous territories. And yet, things like this are not included within the current scope of risk assessment frameworks that governments are using to evaluate risks.
So why does this matter? Canada's current risk assessment process undermine our collective climate resilience. These assessments miss the bigger picture by failing to account for the complexities of natural systems, how ecosystems, communities, and governance structures interact and depend on one another. They remain incomplete, fragmented, and ultimately ineffective. Beyond these core issues, our report from Risk to Resilience identifies 5 specific ways in which Indigenous peoples are systemically excluded from risk assessment and response. There's lack of representation, so Indigenous voices and governance systems are not meaningfully included in decision making. There's clashing worldviews where risk assessments prioritize Western colonial perspectives while dismissing Indigenous ways of knowing. There's human-centric versus life-centric approaches. Climate risk is viewed primarily through the lens of human infrastructure and economic loss, rather than the interconnected health of land, water, and all living things. There's artificial separations. Conventional frameworks, they separate risks into isolated categories, ignoring the relationship between climate, land, culture, and governance. And then there's failure to appreciate scale. Risk is assessed in short-term, localized ways rather than considering long-term cumulative and regional impacts. So we'll focus on 3 of these challenges, breaking down the key issues before shifting into what must be done to create a more holistic, inclusive, and effective approach to climate resilience.
Yeah, so like Brett said, first and foremost, there is very little diverse representation within government planning. In Canada, policymaking and planning, Indigenous people are not represented, included, or listened to in substantive terms. And while this has been a common theme across climate policy, in the context of a risk assessment, this means that any plans that are created may or may not be relevant or even applicable to community context. You know, for example, my own community is rural. We are along Highway 16 and we have limited access to healthcare due to rotating hospital closures. In an emergency, community members are not able to access reliable healthcare in the same way that more urban communities are able to. During the 2021 heat dome that happened in BC, some of the provincial guidance was to seek cooling centers, which really did not exist in our rural setting. Many of our community houses do not have air conditioning, and we have no way to purchase air conditioning without driving 2 hours to the next hub city. So, in other words, the high level plans that were rolled out and put in place really didn't work for us. Another thing is that risk assessments, as they are now, do not distinguish between continuous and seasonal risks. For example, in British Columbia, many communities are vulnerable to impacts from flooding during the spring. Flooding is consistently ranked as Canada's most expensive hazard, but flood risk tends to ebb and flow during the summer as communities move into drought and fire impacts. Flood risk still remains, but the prioritization and the rank of the importance shifts as communities move from one season's hazards to the next. And because of the lack of representation within governments, this local view of seasonal risks is not factored into plans, which essentially limits the overall usefulness of the assessment simply by who is and who is not included in creating the plan itself.
And number two, when we talk about risk, inherent, intangible, and cultural values they're rarely captured, or if they are, they're not weighted equally within assessments. As a result, these values, though just as important, are often overlooked or dismissed in risk frameworks. These so-called intangibles might be harder to measure, but that doesn't make them less critical when deciding where to prioritize adaptation planning and resources, especially in Indigenous communities. This includes things like generational knowledge transmission or the skills tied to harvesting and cultural practices. For example, in a recent discussion on food security, the risks to salmon and risks to salmon, an engineer suggested that the economic value of salmon could be calculated and communities could be compensated accordingly. But this completely ignores the deeper layers of meaning. So knowing how to run the smokehouse, how to jar fish, um, and the teachings that come with harvesting. Those skills, that knowledge, that connection, none of it fits neatly into risk assessment, but it's just as important, if not more so, than economic value of the fish itself. Quantifying these values in dollars is not only challenging, but it often misses the point entirely. We don't fully understand what's at stake without them in risk assessments. If we lose salmon, yes, we lose a food source, but we also lose the knowledge, the practices, and relationships that we have sustained, that has sustained our people for generations. Western risk assessments, they focus on dollars and cents. The Gitsan worldview, it recognizes that the salmon, they're not just a resource, they're teachers, they're part of governance, they're part of who we are. And they also just really make the world that we exist and have grown up in that has made us what it is. Like the nutrients that the salmon provide is not just for us, it's for everything else that lives in our ecosystem. So these differences in worldview are exactly why mainstream risk assessments, they fail to reflect the realities of Indigenous communities.
And similarly, another example that links back to how we understand risk is that many Indigenous nations held balanced and reciprocal relationships with fire and firekeeping. Communities would strategically burn out areas of land to achieve multiple stewardship values on the landscape. However, when settlers arrived, they perceived traditional burning as a risk and they outlawed the practice entirely, starting the very long history of fire suppression that we have in this country. And as you probably know by now, and what Western scientists can now confirm, is what Indigenous nations have known for a very, very long time, is that fire suppression does not make fire less of a risk. It quite literally fuels the flames. By not burning, we create a fuel load and conditions that contribute to the mega fires that we've been experiencing over the past couple of years. So in this case, fire itself was never the risk. Our broken relationship and the change in the worldview was. So within current risk assessments, this nuance is left out and is misaligned with how communities perceive and understand risk related to things like fire because of the massive difference in worldview between Indigenous communities and colonial governments and who's decided what's important.
And number three is the human-centric versus life-centric approaches. So back to salmon as an example, Indigenous knowledges recognize that we are caretakers within an interconnected system where all living things or non-human kin have value beyond what they're perceived by humans. For Gitxsan, the salmon are not just a resource, they're vital to our culture, our way of life, and the land itself. So more than that, salmon have otsen. Otsen in our language is energy, life energy, or as the priest, the translator of language called it spirit. That's its inherent worth. So risk assessments, however, only measure the value in terms of human cost and benefit. So if something doesn't serve us directly, it's ignored. Never mind that salmon are keystone species, and never mind that they nourish the forests that help the trees grow taller and provide shade that can lower temperatures by up to 12 degrees during heat waves and potentially saving lives. The Western risk assessments break climate issues into isolated problems, making them more straightforward and cheaper to manage. But this fragmented approach fails to capture the real risks that we face. Our health comes from our culture, and our culture comes from the land and water. We must move beyond human centered models to build meaningful risk assessments and recognize deep interconnected ways that sustain life.
But how can we do that? If we want to maintain the processes inside the ecosystem that function by working together, we need to kind of create effective climate policy that needs to prioritize relationships and connection rather than focusing solely on the impacts to people, to individuals, and to property. For Indigenous people, resilience is deeply rooted in governance and ways of life, as well as within worldview. Our ways of being emphasize interconnectedness and reciprocity, as well as adaptability. To us, resilience manifests through several core principles and practices, including interconnectedness and reciprocity. So Indigenous communities have long viewed the world as an interconnected web where humans, animals, plants, and the land are all interdependent. This holistic perspective fosters a sense of responsibility and care for the environment, which helps to support community resilience. The second thing is adaptability and innovation. So we as Indigenous people have a long history of adapting to changes within our environment. For example, controlled burns to manage forest health demonstrate a proactive approach to environmental stewardship. Cultural continuity. Maintaining cultural practices, languages, and laws strengthen community bonds and identity, which are also crucial for resilience. They support collective action and mutual aid in times of crisis while helping to share knowledge and resources. And all of these things help to overall enhance the resilience of the whole community. And last thing is sustainable living practices. So Indigenous ways of being are often emphasized as sustainability and living in harmony with all beings that are a part of the community surrounding ecosystem. It includes using resources in a way that are helping to ensure the availability of those resources for future generations, which is a key aspect of resilience. So by incorporating these principles into broader risk assessment frameworks, we can develop a more comprehensive understanding of resilience that incorporates Indigenous communities' rich, adaptive strategies that are more holistic and are really essential for addressing the complex and interconnected challenges that are being posed by climate change.
So inclusivity and equitability. So risk narratives, they must be inclusive and equitable. By incorporating diverse understandings of risk, we ensure that assessments respect different ways of knowing, leading to more just and effective climate adaptation and decision making. Including multiple perspectives also strengthens risk assessments, enhancing their accuracy and relevance. The more voices we bring, the more complete and applicable the evaluation becomes. Many communities already do this through guardianship programs, which help land priorities and values. Like the Gitnyao Nation, they monitor salmon populations, they enhance salmon spawning grounds. This also includes revitalizing traditional controlled burn areas, which clears culturally significant areas while reducing the risk of larger, more destructive wildfires. And in my work, I have colonized the term cultural infrastructure to connect indigenous ways of knowing with Western perspectives. Traditionally, this term has been associated with art spaces and museums, but I apply it to refer to the intricate ecological interventions and infrastructure that were created by indigenous peoples. So this table here, you can see um, cultural infrastructure versus Western or built infrastructure versus natural infrastructure, and really just kind of highlighting the differences between them. Typically, a lot of indigenous ways of knowing have always been relegated to nature-based solutions or natural infrastructure, but it's not. We built these systems. We have always maintained these systems. They weren't just there. We didn't just approach this land and it was like it was when we like this when we got here. We built it. So a lot of things like clam gardens, fishing weirs, trade paths, control burns, traditional harvesting and processing systems, they were built by the people throughout the different ecosystems across the lands. So when we look at how the relationality is through time, cultural infrastructure is intergenerational, designed for long-term economic prosperity to sustain resources and knowledge over generations, whereas built infrastructure is more short to medium term, and it's often designed around economic return. Nature Natural infrastructure, they're long term, but it's also not always integrated with cultural governance systems. But it's something that requires protection and prevent harmful development around it. And in that built infrastructure, Western built infrastructure, it's very much more extractive and disruptive to natural systems, where cultural infrastructure is a little more relational and reciprocal and enhancing ecological systems. So to truly connect knowledge systems, we need different voices and perspectives and ways of understanding risk. A strong braid isn't made from just one strand, it's woven by many.
And this kind of goes hand in hand with the second kind of guidepost on creating more resilience within our communities, which is that risk narratives need to be holistic. Local expertise and community insights provide valuable insight that complement scientific data and models, capturing a lot of the nuance and the complexities that may be overlooked within standard, Western risk assessment models alone. Our people know our own context best. We need adaptation actions that are inclusive and holistic rather than reactive. And what I mean by this is that we need to be actively involved from start to finish. We are meant to be actively involved in taking care of the land, considering not just ourselves, but the relationships and the interactions around us. This is part of what reciprocation, relationship, and responsibility really means. If we want the land to take care of us, we need to start to once again take care of her. Effective risk assessment narratives need to be guided by our responsibility to the bigger picture while still considering the smaller working pieces that operate around us. Risk narratives ultimately need to be contextually relevant and place-based as well. So different understandings of risk are often rooted in specific cultural, social, and ecological contexts. By integrating diverse perspectives, climate risk narratives become more contextually relevant and responsive to the needs, the values, and the priorities of the affected communities and ecosystems. To quote a presentation that I heard a couple of months ago from the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, one size does not fit all. Policies, programs, emergency planning, as well as risk narratives should not be done in silos, ignoring the distinct strengths, vulnerabilities, and needs of each community. Instead, risk narratives should include place-based knowledge and expertise, targeting the specific needs, values, and priorities of each community.
So human-driven climate change is moving at an unprecedented pace, but so is our ability to respond. Risk assessments must reflect this by being dynamic, adaptable, and rooted in the ever-changing relationship between communities and the land. Rather than static snapshots, risk narratives should be living stories, evolving with how communities see, experience, and adapt to climate change. When grounded in community values, the lived realities, risk assessments become more than just reports, they become narrative resilience. We must change the story, shifting from risk and loss to strength and adaptation. As scientists, practitioners, and people in relationship with the earth, we must do a better job of telling and listening to the whole story.
Yeah, so to be actually Nisam for listening. We can answer any questions now. We usually like to leave a lot of space for discussion and room for, engagement on these ideas. So yeah, thank you for listening and yeah, we're happy to do that now.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was, yeah, remarkable. Thanks for your time and such a great presentation. So yeah, we just encourage anyone to submit any questions that they might have into the Q&A section of this Zoom chat. We do have one question maybe to start us off in the chat. This comes from Catherine. So they ask, does prescribed burning help control tick populations?
Um, it's hard to say. Like I wouldn't feel safe saying yes, because it's ticks. They have so many different means of transportation and transmission, and fires. If they were able to control that, we would see that being effective with the beetle kill that you see spreading across with the pine. It's the wildfires haven't stopped it. So yeah, hopefully that answers that. It'd be kind of interesting to see what those types of things can do for that. But the insects are so resilient to how they live within the ecosystem. So that's just I think it's inevitable that they're just moving north because of changing climate.
Great, thank you. So our next question is, how do you handle big or small setbacks in your work?
Do you want to go first,
And do you
Brett?
want to start? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I can
Yeah.
start. I can start. Yeah, I think for me, like big and small setbacks, like I think that, that's part of building resilience. Like when we're talking about building resilience within our ecosystems, it's also about building resilience within your own self and your own work and really being resilient in how you interact with the world. So I think that, for my own part, I think it's just about being tenacious and continuing to try. Like there is value in the attempt and I'm still kind of young, so I'm still kind of figuring that out for myself. But yeah, so far it's been really good to kind of work out how to meet these challenges. Brett?
Yeah. For me, I think if if your work is really there to make change and to make difference, then um, it will be challenged. And I'm just a little bit older than Janna, just a tiny bit, but it's for me. I've experienced a lot of that throughout my career and the different things that I've done throughout my career, and a lot of it is really having a good support community. I didn't have a lot of that kind of support when I was coming up through trying to find my way, trying to figure out how I can tell this story, to do these types of projects, and to do this type of work. Um, and so what I do now is I try to provide that support to Janna whenever she needs it as another young Gitxsan person. She's making moves and doing great things with the ideas she has on her own, but just to have me being there to be able to just answer some questions, it could be random things like, how are we going to deal with this, or what, I just had interaction with this person, they challenged me with this. Just having that support, it's very important. It's something that I didn't have, and I did from my family, but being away from my community, being away from people for so long, it's difficult. So really just trying to build your own support community outside, especially of your peers and your colleagues, like having those who truly understand the work that you're trying to do. And I would say the biggest component to getting past setbacks is to honestly just breaking down patriarchy, changing the way that systems are built to, not necessarily support advancement in the work itself, but support who gets the money. And that's the way it is right now. Everyone's trying to protect their project money, their funding for different things, instead of really trying to advance the different research and knowledge systems that are out there. And that's really because it's a patriarchal capitalist system. And we just have to all try to navigate that and to dismantle it, because it's the only way we're going to change. And this is just in my opinion.
Mhm. Thank you so much. So we've got a lot of questions. So we've got like 19 minutes still, so we'll try to get through as many as we can. But the next one that we have up is there a project or projects or risk assessments in Canada that have espoused much or all of the processes and perspectives that you spoke of earlier today?
I think, like, from my perspective and what I've seen so far, I think that there's a lot of momentum towards doing things differently. I think people are kind of noticing that these processes are inadequate and not working. And I think what Brett and I, like we said at the beginning of the presentation, is wanted to present, something different so people could start to talk about, what could be changed in this process and how can we move forward in a way that makes more sense and is allowing us to really do things differently. In terms of actual assessments that are being done differently, I think a lot of places are still kind of at the starting place. They're figuring out how they might want to engage differently. They're figuring out, what levers they're able to pull in and how they're able to kind of work within these large systems differently. Brett?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a move toward significant change in the processes, but it's still quite behind. I had a colleague who was at a housing conference recently, and when they were talking about, there was someone there who specifically worked in risk. I'm not going to say names right now, but they their narrative and their discussion around risk to a largely First Nations audience still didn't really hit the mark. It was still very a westernized approach. They specialized in risk assessment, but I think they were missing so many key elements that a lot of the people couldn't relate to. So it's still kind of behind. But a lot of my work too is moving in a direction where I can at least help try to change the narrative. And one of those being I sit on the PIVC committee. PIVC is an engineering risk assessment process that was developed for engineers internationally, but it's currently looked after by the Climate Risk Institute. Um, but they're making moves, and they also work with the Ontario First Nations Technical Services, ONTSC, who have developed the FNIRT program. And so that's a First Nations risk assessment process. And they do a lot of work around Ontario, but across the country as well. So they're just one of the spaces that are taking risk assessment in a little bit of a different way. But I think, again, it's what Jan and I are doing is really just trying to bring more awareness to this, because there does need to be more change. Things are kind of moving in the right direction, but I think there still could be a lot more done to make this kind of change.
Great, thank you. So the next question that we have is, do you include spiritual infrastructure in the realm of cultural infrastructure? And can you talk a bit about how that relates to an approach to the environment?
Yeah, well, with cultural infrastructure, I mean, spirituality is just inherently a component of that. I think, and the work will speak to that a little bit more. So a lot of my work in cultural infrastructure will be released soon. It's part of the infrastructure resource tool that we're building for the Climate Atlas of Canada. So you'd be able to go to the Climate Atlas of Canada and check out the resource soon. We're just finishing that project up, and there'll be a lot more information on cultural infrastructure there, which can kind of get down into the details. But yeah, through the cultural practices and the stories, the case stories, and what I call in our language, or what we call in our language, adawak, the spirituality is going to definitely be a part of that. Um, and a lot of things that we do, we start in ceremony. Regardless of what the projects are, what the work is, we started in ceremony. I just don't make ceremony a highlighted key point because ceremony is just one aspect of what we do. And often I find a lot of Western people tend to make it more like a religious thing, and spirituality is not religion. It's very much a context and understanding the life's energy and the way that we interact with the world. Um, and so ceremony will be a part of a lot of things inherently. And I think that's just when you start to learn from your communities that you're surrounded by. And this is one thing I recommend to a lot of people. If you want to talk to knowledge carriers, look to the communities that you live in and kind of begin there and try to connect to some of the people that are there to share their knowledge systems with you. And just like any other society, we have people that are specialists in different aspects of life. So I find a lot of times people will go to knowledge carriers and put a lot of pressure on them and being experts in ecology or experts in like, design or whatever it may be, when really some of them are spiritual knowledge carriers, and that's what they focus on. Not to say that that can't be relevant to anything else. It's just really important to understand that, for me as a Gitxsan person, the way that I was raised in our Yushlamach, our education system, our pedagogy, I was brought up learning more about ecology. And so my background is a little more on ecology and governance. So that's where my specialty is. And, and now it's kind of a lot of that has kind of relayed and pushed its way into climate. Um, so there are other people who are specialists, they understand law and they focus on law. There are other specialists who are in medicine and they both have the ceremonial context of medicine, but they also have the Western, their PhDs, they're practitioners. So there's different people that have different ways of knowing. I think it's incumbent upon the people who are going into these spaces to really themselves uh, learn about who they're connecting with and how they can meaningfully connect to people who are relevant to the work they're doing. Hopefully that answered that.
I think that was great. Thank you. So can you comment on whether or either the pandemic or the current uncertain economic times has reduced people's prioritization of climate risk response in your community or in the broader conversation?
It's I just had discussions with this because I actually do a lot of like international work, again with Adaptation Futures, but I also do a lot of work in the country here. And speaking with a lot of my colleagues that work in different levels of government, we are kind of worried about the way, what are we going to do in this narrative going forward? Where the imagination of the policymakers and the people in governments, they're pushing energy infrastructure. What are we going to do to instead think of things in a little bit different way? Yes, we want to have economic sovereignty and independence. Um, Indigenous people have always wanted that. I think that's the biggest misconception. When we want to stop pipelines, it's not because we don't want economic development. It's because of the fashion in which those infrastructures are built, what they destroy, and what the long-term outcomes mean for everyone, not just us, but everything and everyone that lives and depends on these lands. Because we are the ones that live in a very small margin of survivability, not the earth. The earth is going to be fine without us, but we're the ones that depend on a small margin of survivability. Plants will adapt, everything will move, but we have a harder time because of the way we've built our societies. Well, not we, I shouldn't say we, the way the Western world has built their societies. My people didn't do that. We're forced to live in these systems. So I think a lot of what we're trying to do is bring a different perspective. And it's, looking at the pluriverse of perspectives that exists in around the globe. When we collectively start to think of the world we're living in, we have to have more imagination. We have to challenge the people in government to have more imagination than, oh, we need more economy. This is all we got to do right now. Like if they're saying this is our only option, that concept, I mean, really, we've been through a pandemic. Look what people did through that pandemic, uh, to be a little bit discomfort, go through some discomfort, but we, made it through it. So what I'm asking, uh, politicians or people in positions of power, why don't you try to be a little bit uncomfortable, make some changes, think of things differently? Our people in the short 150 years that Canada has claimed its existence, um, we've saw our whole ecosystem and world utterly destroyed and changed. So we are adapting. And I think we can provide people with a good path forward in adapting to show how we are adapting so that the world can adapt in a better way because we have already been forced to do that as Indigenous people. So I think we can provide a lot of context to how we can make it through the tough parts of what we face through the anthropogenic climate change.
Thanks, Brett. Have you seen an example of a risk assessment or adaptation plan that does a good or maybe a better job of learning from Indigenous perspectives?
Janna, do you want to?
Yeah, I think like that's an interesting question because like there are so many indigenous nations that have adaptation plans that, have already done the work. They've already done the work to make sure that their values are aligned with the plan. They're already done the work to engage their community members to make sure it makes sense in their own perspective and in their own context. In BC here, there's, Kanaka Bar is a really good example. They've done a lot of really comprehensive work about what risk means in their territory and what they're going to be looking at for generations to come. I've seen examples on Haida Gwaii. They've got a lot of really good strong risk assessments. So I think that communities are getting there themselves in terms of more Western frameworks. Kind of like the first question we answered, I think that they're still figuring out how do they do this in a way that makes sense. A couple of weeks ago, I was a part of a scoping process to kind of figure out, where are the push points? How can we make this process different for the BC provincial risk assessment? So it seems like, if you go more local, if you go more municipal, there's usually good examples there. I think that provincially, I think that territorially, and I think that nationally, I think that they're still working out how to kind of get to that same place. But that's what I've kind of seen in the last little bit. Don't know if you have anything to add, Brett.
Yeah, everything that Janet mentioned, I also would recommend checking out the First Nations Infrastructure Resilience Toolkit that was developed by Ontario First Nations Technical Services. Um, they've done a few projects and are currently in the process of finishing some risk assessment projects with First Nations that are looking at really a different way of approaching risk assessment. So they do the typical risk assessment for the community, but they also include uh, Indigenous perspectives through their process. Um, and it's going to be a familiar process too. So for those who have already utilized PIVC risk assessment process, FNRT was an evolution of that. And PIVC is working closely to try to, with First Nations and Indigenous communities, to try to advance and change the way that they're looking at risk. But again, like it's still just a matter of, I think, people requesting it, people communicating it, and trying to figure out how to develop these frameworks for that. But OFNTSC does have some examples, so if you can take a look at their site as well. PyVC, I think, also has on their website some of the stuff that FNRT has already done. So I think they have case studies on there as an example.
Amazing, thank you. So as landscape architects who often wear many hats related to land development, how do you best see our profession supporting the initiatives and sort of the thoughts that you have presented earlier today?
I think just for myself, I've been very fortunate to spend a lot of time working with landscape architects. I was a practitioner in residence with the program at U of M. So I got to work with some great professors and great students. There's also the Indigenous Design Program or association that was operating there. It's, I think where the opportunity is for landscape architects is while they're doing their projects and assessments, when you're looking at from the large scale to small scale projects, it's just really taking into consideration the land as you create these projects. What are we really trying to build, and are we making these spaces safe not just for humans but all the things like the bees, the other animals that might migrate through wildlife corridors. I know small projects is harder to do, and then sometimes you're going to have a client who is just, we want this, we want it to look like this, and I also think a lot of times architects, landscape architects, when they're looking at indigenous perspectives, some of them are contending with the romanticization of imagery and saying, "Oh, do we need like a star shape here or something like?" That's not what putting indigenous perspectives into designing is. I think it's really more looking at how they view the world, how they want to build, and then you can incorporate those kind of perspectives into your work and really move around the designs that way.
I think just to add on to Brett's like earlier point as well, like from a young person's perspective and from somebody that's just getting into the career space is like look around and notice who's at the table with you, who's missing from these conversations, right? Like make an effort to build space and time into your practice to mentor others and to support others because the thing that I'm realizing is like we really have to work together. We really need to be sharing these spaces, and that's what we're meant to be doing, right? Like, so just really work to create space for younger people to share what you know with other people and learn from them. I've been really fortunate to have mentors like Brett in my life, to have, supervisors that have been very supportive and I'm happy to share what I know with them as well, even though I'm a little bit younger. So be open to that knowledge, be open to that sharing too.
Thank you. Yeah, Brett, I was reminded of what you were talking about earlier with cultural infrastructure and the relationships that Indigenous people have with the land. It wasn't like this magical thing that just appeared overnight, but it was this like intense relationship with place and how things all worked together and all of the things that it worked with. So yeah, thank you so much for that answer. One last question is, do you have any recommendations on how we could get involved with our local communities to increase climate resilience?
Yeah, I think for me, I think it's really just trying to find spaces that you can contribute to, whether they be, looking at community space, how people are using community space, if you can contribute to engagement that the city or your municipality or community is having around those spaces. Try to bring a different perspective on how we should be mindful of, you know, adaptation. I think the biggest thing is, saying how can we restore some of the land's natural flow or ecosystem into our living spaces. And it's sometimes not as difficult, sometimes it can be, but sometimes it's not as difficult as it seems. And really connecting to community groups. There are a lot of different groups. Some of them are all volunteer, no funding. Some of them have a lot of funding. and have different capacities in which they're involved. I'm currently working on green space plan and bylaw and biodiversity policy for the city of Winnipeg. And we are getting a lot of organizations coming in to engage who are both volunteer as well as funded organizations within the city of Winnipeg. And it's a great project that we're working on. The engagement is there, and I think a lot of people are really interested in making some change. And I think community members across the country, whether they're in a large urban center or rural communities, they're trying to find ways to look at this and to change. Like some of them want to make change somehow. Janna?
Can you repeat the question for me? You cut out when the question is being asked. Sorry.
It was just more or less like, how would you recommend that people get involved with the local community
Mm.
to help with resilience, climate resilience learning?
Yeah, I think just like like I kind of said earlier, I think just like opening the space. Like I think that, communities are thinking about these things. Communities are already thinking about how to build resilience and what they want to see and, a lot of these plans that are being developed. And we have good ideas. We've been in relationship with the land since time immemorial, and I think that that is what a lot of Western experts seem to overlook or forget is that Indigenous people have been here since time immemorial. We have the knowledge, we have the lived experience. So I think it's just about building those relationships and taking the time to be authentic and genuine in kind of interacting with folks. I can always tell when people are not being genuine with me, and it's going to impact how we're able to work together. So I think that just, coming from a place of, heart-centered approaches and being conscious in the ways that you interact with people are kind of really good foundational things when you're thinking about reaching out and having, interactions with communities. I think those are really things to keep in mind.
Great. Well, that just brings us to the end of our question period. So I just want to say another huge thank you to both of you, Brett and Janna. You got some big thank yous and congratulations in the chat. So thanks again for spending your time with us today and sharing your knowledge. I guess just some other housekeeping things. So I just wanted to remind you all of some of the upcoming webinars that we have. So these are also available on the CSLA's website, but our May programming is Adaptive Coexistence, Building Resilience in a Fear-Driven World. And then our June session will be on biodiversity net gain, so a path to scalable ecological restoration. Just want to thank everyone again for joining and wish you a great weekend ahead. Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.